She was the woman who died alongside Adolf Hitler in his Berlin bunker, choosing to marry him in their final hours before taking her own life. Eva Braun's name has become forever linked with the darkest chapter of human history. Yet, while much has been written about her relationship with the Führer, far less attention has been paid to those who shared her bloodline. What became of Eva Braun's family after the fall of the Third Reich? How did her parents, her sisters, and her niece navigate a world that would forever associate their name with Nazi Germany's most infamous dictator? The answers reveal a complex web of denial, adaptation, and the desperate struggle to escape an inescapable legacy. In this video, we will explore the fates of Eva Braun's family members and discover how they each dealt with the weight of their notorious connection to Hitler. So, without further ado, let's start with the woman herself and then examine what happened to those closest to her. Eva Anna Paula Braun was born on February 6, 1912, in Munich, Bavaria, to Friedrich Braun, a schoolteacher, and Franziska Katharina Kronberger, a seamstress. She was the second of three daughters in a solidly middle-class Catholic family. Her early years were unremarkable, spent attending a lyceum and then a convent school in Simbach am Inn, where she excelled in athletics and displayed a particular fondness for gymnastics and skiing. After finishing her education in 1929, Eva began working as a photographer's assistant at Heinrich Hoffmann's studio in Munich. It was here, in October 1929, that the 17-year-old Eva first encountered Adolf Hitler, who was then 40 years old and already gaining prominence as the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Their meeting was deceptively ordinary, with Hitler initially presenting himself as Herr Wolf, a pseudonym he used to maintain some privacy. Hoffmann, who served as Hitler's personal photographer and had become one of his closest associates, facilitated the relationship that would gradually develop over the following months. Eva's role in Hitler's life evolved slowly and deliberately over the next several years. Unlike the wives of other Nazi leaders who basked in public recognition and participated actively in party functions, Eva was kept meticulously hidden from public view. Hitler, ever conscious of his image as a leader married to Germany itself, insisted on maintaining the fiction that he was a bachelor devoted entirely to the nation. This meant that Eva spent years living in a strange twilight existence, provided with comfortable apartments, and later residing at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, but always carefully concealed from official photographs and state occasions. She occupied herself with sports, photography, and the company of her small circle of friends and family, particularly her younger sister, Gretl. Hitler visited when his schedule allowed, showering her with gifts and attention during their time together, but their relationship remained clandestine. Eva's devotion to Hitler was absolute, despite his frequent absences and the frustration of her perpetually hidden status. She made two suicide attempts in the 1930s, first with a pistol in 1932 and then with sleeping pills in 1935, both attributed to the emotional strain of her position and fears that Hitler might end their relationship. These incidents seemed only to strengthen Hitler's attachment to her, and he became more attentive afterward, though he still refused to acknowledge her publicly. As the Second World War progressed and Germany's fortunes began to turn, Eva's life became increasingly circumscribed. She remained at the Berghof for much of the war, largely shielded from the brutal realities of the conflict. Her correspondence and diary entries from this period reveal a woman living in a bizarre bubble of normalcy, concerned with fashion, films, and her dogs while the world burned around her. She wrote to friends about the challenges of obtaining cosmetics and complained about wartime rationing, seemingly oblivious or deliberately blind to the horrors being perpetrated in her country's name. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from all sides, Eva made a decision that would define her place in history. Against Hitler's wishes, she travelled to Berlin in April 1945 to join him in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. It was an act of loyalty that would seal her fate. In the claustrophobic underground complex, as Soviet artillery pounded the city above and the Third Reich entered its death throes, Eva remained by Hitler's side. On April 29, 1945, with the Red Army just blocks away, Hitler finally agreed to marry her in a brief civil ceremony conducted by a city official. Eva Hitler, as she signed her name in the marriage register, would bear that surname for less than 40 hours. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces fought their way through Berlin's government quarter, Eva and Adolf Hitler retreated to his private quarters in the bunker. The details of what transpired have been reconstructed from the testimony of those who were present in the bunker that day. Eva, dressed in a black dress, sat on the sofa beside her husband. She chose to end her life by biting into a cyanide capsule, the same method Hitler would employ moments later after also shooting himself with his pistol. Their bodies were carried up the bunker stairs by staff members, placed in a shallow depression in the Reich Chancellery garden, doused with petrol and set ablaze as Soviet shells continued to fall on Berlin. The charred remains were later discovered by Soviet troops, though it would be years before the full details of Hitler's death became widely known. Eva Braun. Hitler's life had ended at the age of 33, but for her family members who survived, the ordeal was just beginning. Friedrich Braun, known as Fritz to his family and friends, was born in 1879 and had built a respectable career as a teacher in Munich's educational system. By all accounts, he was a conventional middle-class professional, somewhat rigid in his manner but devoted to his family. His background was thoroughly Catholic and conservative, representing the solid bourgeois values that had characterized Bavaria for generations. Fritz had married Franziska Katharina Kronberger, known as Fanny, in 1908, and together they had raised their 3 daughters in a modest but comfortable home in Munich. As his daughter Eva's relationship with Hitler developed in the early 1930s, Fritz found himself in an impossible position. Hitler's growing political power made him simultaneously the most eligible man in Germany and the most controversial. Fritz, who harboured reservations about the National Socialist movement and maintained his Catholic faith's traditional skepticism toward radical political movements, could hardly forbid his adult daughter from seeing anyone she chose, particularly someone who was becoming the most powerful man in the country. The Braun family's relationship with Hitler was cordial, but never warm. Hitler made occasional visits to the Braun home in the early years of his relationship with Eva, and he demonstrated the charm and attention to social niceties that he could deploy when it suited him. He sent gifts to the family and ensured that they were materially comfortable, particularly as his power grew. Fritz Braun accepted a position that Hitler arranged for him, though the details of this employment remain somewhat murky in historical records. What is clear is that the family benefited financially from Eva's connection to the Führer, even as Fritz maintained a certain emotional distance from the Nazi regime. He attended few, if any, party functions and avoided public association with Hitler beyond what was necessary. Fanny Braun was perhaps more accepting of the relationship, pleased that her daughter had found such a powerful protector, even if the circumstances were unconventional. She enjoyed the material comforts that came with Eva's position and maintained a closer relationship with the Führer than her husband did, though she too was kept largely separate from Hitler's political life. As the war progressed and Germany's situation became increasingly desperate, the Braun parents found themselves in a precarious position. They had enjoyed years of comfort and security due to their daughter's relationship with Hitler, but they had also become inexorably linked to the Nazi regime in the eyes of many. Fritz continued his work as a teacher throughout the war years, though the education system itself had become thoroughly Nazified by this point. The content of lessons had been shaped to promote Nazi ideology, and teachers were expected to be at least nominally supportive of the regime. Whether Fritz actively participated in this ideological instruction or merely went through the motions to protect his position and his family is unknown, but his continued employment suggests, at minimum, an accommodation with the system, if not active support. The family received news of Eva's death in May 1945 through unofficial channels, as the bunker survivors dispersed into the chaos of defeated Germany. The details were fragmentary and confused at first, but gradually the truth emerged. Their daughter had chosen to die with Hitler in the bunker rather than attempt to escape or surrender to Allied forces. The immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender in May 1945 brought new terrors for those associated with the Nazi regime. Allied forces, particularly American troops in Bavaria, were engaged in a massive effort to round up Nazi officials, collaborators, and anyone who might have information about war crimes or the regime's final days. The Braun family name, once a source of prestige due to Eva's connection to Hitler, now became a liability. Fritz and Fanny Braun were detained by American authorities in June 1945, part of the systematic effort to identify and interrogate anyone who might provide information about Hitler's inner circle. They were separated and questioned extensively about Eva's relationship with Hitler. their knowledge of Nazi activities, and their own involvement with the regime. The interrogations were thorough and often uncomfortable, as American intelligence officers sought to piece together the details of Hitler's final days and to understand the personal dynamics of his inner circle. Fritz Braun's interrogations revealed a man eager to distance himself from any ideological commitment to Nazism. He portrayed himself as a simple teacher who had been caught up in circumstances beyond his control, a father who had disapproved of his daughter's relationship but had been powerless to stop it. He emphasized his Catholic faith and his traditional values, suggesting that these had always put him at odds with National Socialist ideology even as he had benefited from his daughter's position. Whether the American interrogators believed these protestations is unclear from the surviving records, but Fritz was eventually released from detention after several weeks. He had not been a party member, had held no official position in the Nazi government beyond his teaching role, and there was no evidence of his participation in war crimes or significant collaboration beyond the general complicity of living comfortably under the regime. Fanny Braun underwent similar questioning and was also released, though she reportedly struggled more with the interrogations, becoming emotional when discussing Eva's death and the family's circumstances. The denazification process that swept through Germany in the years following the war posed new challenges for the Braun family. This systematic effort to remove Nazi influence from German society involved questionnaires, tribunals, and classifications that determined each person's level of involvement with the regime and the consequences they would face. Fritz Braun was classified as a Mitläufer, or fellow traveller, the second lowest category in the denazification system. This classification was applied to those who had supported the regime but had not been active participants in its crimes. It meant he faced relatively minor consequences compared to active Nazis. He was required to pay a modest fine and was initially prohibited from returning to teaching, though this restriction was later relaxed as the urgent need for teachers in occupied Germany became apparent, and as the denazification process became less stringent in the face of Cold War realities. By 1950, Fritz had been allowed to return to educational work, though he kept a low profile and avoided any discussion of his family's connection to Hitler. Fritz Braun's final years were spent in quiet obscurity in Munich. He had lost his daughter in the most dramatic and public way imaginable, watched his family name become forever associated with the Nazi regime, and endured the humiliation of interrogations and denazification proceedings. The comfortable middle-class life he had built before the war had been shattered, though not as completely as it might have been. He retained his home and was able to return to work, privileges that many Germans associated with the regime did not enjoy. Friends and neighbours who had known the family before the war treated them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Some maintained their relationships, understanding that the Brauns had been caught up in events beyond their control. Others shunned them entirely, unable to separate the family from their association with Hitler. Fritz reportedly became increasingly withdrawn in his later years, rarely speaking about Eva and avoiding any discussion of the war years. He died in May 1964 at the age of 84, having outlived his famous daughter by nearly 2 decades. His death received no public notice beyond a brief obituary in the local Munich newspaper, a far cry from the attention that had once surrounded his family due to Eva's relationship with Hitler. Franziska Braun, known as Fanny, survived her husband by several years, living quietly in Munich, supported by a modest pension and the assistance of her surviving daughters. She maintained the fierce maternal loyalty that had characterized her relationship with Eva, refusing to condemn her daughter's choices even when pressed by curious journalists or historians. In the rare instances when she spoke about Eva, Fanny portrayed her as a devoted young woman who had loved Hitler deeply and who had made her choice to stay with him of her own free will. She rejected any suggestion that Eva had been manipulated or victimized, insisting that her daughter had known her own mind and had chosen her fate deliberately. This defense of Eva's agency, while perhaps comforting to a mother, did little to rehabilitate the family's reputation. Fanny died in 1976 at the age of 96, taking with her whatever private thoughts and memories she had of her daughter's life and death. Her passing was noted even more briefly than her husband's had been, and the Braun family name gradually faded from public consciousness as the generation that had lived through the war died off. Eva Braun's older sister, Ilsa Braun, was born in 1909 and had lived a very different life from her more famous sibling. While Eva had pursued a relationship that would place her at the centre of Nazi power, Ilsa had chosen a more conventional path. She trained as a receptionist and secretary, skills that were considered appropriate for young women of her class and era, and she put them to use in various positions in Munich. Ilsa was known within the family as the more serious and responsible of the three sisters, less given to the romantic dreams and dramatic gestures that characterized Eva's personality. Her appearance was also different from Eva's. While Eva was petite, blonde, and conventionally pretty in the style that Hitler preferred, Ilsa was taller, darker, and more severe in her features. This physical difference may have contributed to the different paths their lives took, as Hitler showed no romantic interest in Ilsa during his visits to the Braun household in the early 1930s. Ilsa's own romantic life led her to marry twice, first to a man whose identity remains obscure in historical records, a marriage that ended in divorce in the late 1930s. Her second marriage was to a businessman named Fritz Braun, not to be confused with her father who shared the same name. This second husband was reportedly a solid, if unexciting man who provided Ilsa with the stability and conventional respectability that Eva's life conspicuously lacked. Ilsa and her second husband had no children, and they maintained a modest household in Munich throughout the war years. Unlike Eva, who lived in luxury at the Berghof and in the apartments Hitler provided for her, Ilsa experienced the war more directly. She dealt with rationing, air raid warnings, and the growing shortages that affected ordinary Germans as the war turned against the Reich. Her relationship with Eva during the war years was reportedly strained at times, with Ilsa disapproving of her sister's willingness to remain willfully ignorant of the regime's crimes while enjoying its benefits. The news of Eva's death in the bunker came as a shock to Ilsa, though perhaps not a complete surprise. She had known that Eva had travelled to Berlin in the final weeks of the war and that her sister had been determined to remain with Hitler regardless of the consequences. The romantic drama of Eva's decision to marry Hitler hours before their joint suicide would have been entirely in character for the sister Ilsa had known all her life. But knowing Eva's tendency toward grand gestures did not make the reality of her death any easier to bear. Ilsa found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight in the months following Germany's surrender. American intelligence officers sought her out for questioning about Eva's relationship with Hitler and about the Braun family's knowledge of Nazi activities. Ilsa's interrogations were particularly focused on Eva's personal life, her relationship with Hitler, and the dynamics within the Führer's inner circle at the Berghof, where Ilsa had occasionally visited her sister. Ilsa proved to be a more forthcoming source of information than her parents. She provided details about Eva's lifestyle, her allowance from Hitler, her shopping habits, and her apparent indifference to politics and the war. Ilsa's testimony painted a picture of Eva as a woman obsessed with fashion, films, and her appearance, someone who preferred to remain ignorant of the horrors being committed in Germany's name rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Whether this portrayal was entirely accurate or whether Ilsa was attempting to minimize her sister's complicity by presenting her as frivolous and naive is difficult to determine from the surviving records. What is clear is that Ilsa was eager to establish her own distance from Nazi ideology and from Hitler himself. She emphasized that she had rarely seen the Führer, had never been a party member, and had lived an ordinary life separate from her sister's extraordinary circumstances. The denazification process treated Ilsa more leniently than it might have, largely because she had not been a party member and could demonstrate that she had maintained her own household and employment separate from Eva's position. She was classified in the lowest category of involvement, essentially cleared of any significant Nazi affiliation. This allowed her to resume her life relatively quickly, though the social stigma of being Eva Braun's sister never entirely disappeared. In post-war Munich, where memories of the bombing raids and the deprivations of war were still fresh, the Braun name carried a particular weight. Ilsa and her husband found that some of their pre-war friends and acquaintances maintained their relationships, while others quietly distanced themselves. The question of how much the family had known about Nazi crimes and how much they had benefited from Eva's position with Hitler hung unspoken in many social interactions. Ilsa made a conscious decision to avoid publicity about her connection to Eva and Hitler. When journalists or historians sought her out in the decades following the war, she generally refused interviews or provided only minimal information. This reticence was partly a desire for privacy, and partly a recognition that anything she said would be scrutinized and potentially used against her family. The few times she did speak publicly about Eva, Ilsa's comments were carefully neutral. She acknowledged her sister's relationship with Hitler, but declined to condemn or defend it, presenting Eva as someone who had made her own choices and lived with the consequences. This measured approach served Ilsa well in navigating the complex social landscape of post-war Germany, where former Nazis and their families had to find ways to reintegrate into a society that was simultaneously trying to come to terms with its recent past and to move forward. In her later years, Ilsa Braun lived quietly in Munich with her husband, maintaining a low profile and rarely venturing into public discussions of the war or her sister. She witnessed the gradual transformation of Germany from the devastated, occupied country of 1945 to the prosperous Federal Republic of the 1960s and 1970s. The economic miracle that rebuilt West Germany brought material comfort back to many families, including the Brauns, though the psychological scars of the war and the Third Reich remained. Ilsa saw the emergence of a new generation of Germans who had no personal memory of the war and for whom the Nazi period was increasingly a matter of history rather than lived experience. This generational shift brought both relief and a strange kind of irrelevance. The younger generation was less interested in the personal details of Hitler's life and relationships, more focused on understanding the systemic failures that had allowed the Holocaust and aggressive war. Eva Braun's role as Hitler's companion seemed increasingly peripheral to the larger questions of guilt and responsibility that German society was grappling with. Ilsa Braun died in 1979 at the age of 70, having outlived her sister by more than 3 decades. Her death was noted in a brief obituary that mentioned her connection to Eva Braun and to Adolf Hitler, but she had succeeded in living most of her post-war life outside the harsh spotlight that had once shone on her family. She left no children to carry on the Braun name or to inherit the complicated legacy of being related to Hitler's companion. Her husband survived her for several years before his own death, and, with their passing, that particular branch of the Braun family came to an end. Ilsa had chosen a path of quiet acceptance and minimal engagement with the past, neither defending her sister's choices nor condemning them publicly, simply acknowledging that they had been made and could not be unmade. The youngest of the Braun sisters presented a far more dramatic and tragic story. Margret Bertha Braun, known throughout her life as Gretl, was born on August 31st, 1915, making her nearly 3 years younger than Eva and 6 years younger than Ilsa. Gretl grew up idolizing her middle sister, following Eva's lead in matters of fashion and behavior, and sharing her love of sports and social activities. The two were particularly close, with Gretl often accompanying Eva on trips and spending extended periods at the Berghof when Hitler allowed it. Unlike the more serious and conventional Ilsa, Gretl shared Eva's tendency toward romantic drama and her relatively apolitical approach to life. She enjoyed the luxuries that came with being Eva Braun's sister, including access to Hitler's mountain retreat with its stunning views, excellent food despite wartime rationing, and the company of interesting if morally compromised people from the upper echelons of Nazi society. It was at the Berghof that Gretl met the man who would become her husband, and whose fate would be intimately tied to the final collapse of the Third Reich. Hermann Otto Fegelein was born on October 30th, 1906, in Ansbach, Bavaria, into a family of modest means. His early life gave little indication of the heights he would reach or the depths to which he would fall. Fegelein initially pursued a career as a professional equestrian, competing in horse racing and show jumping throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. He achieved some success in this field, winning several competitions and earning a reputation as a skilled horseman. His athletic ability and personal charm made him a popular figure in certain social circles, and he cultivated connections with wealthy patrons who supported his sporting career. It was through these equestrian connections that Fegelein first came into contact with members of the Nazi Party, particularly those who shared his interest in horses and outdoor sports. Fegelein joined the Nazi Party in 1933, relatively early in the regime's consolidation of power, and he also became a member of the SS that same year. His initial SS membership number was 66,190, indicating that while he was not among the very earliest members, he had joined before the organization's massive expansion in the late 1930s and during the war. Fegelein's background in horses proved valuable to his SS career, as Heinrich Himmler maintained a particular interest in cavalry units and mounted police formations. Fegelein was assigned to the SS Cavalry School in Munich, where he trained riders and oversaw the development of mounted units. His combination of athletic skill, Nazi party credentials, and personal charisma brought him to the attention of senior SS leaders, and he began to rise through the ranks with notable speed. By 1937, he had achieved the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major, and was overseeing increasingly important assignments related to cavalry training and operations. The outbreak of war in September 1939 provided Fegelein with opportunities for advancement that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. He was initially assigned to cavalry reconnaissance units on the Polish front, where his units participated in the invasion that marked the beginning of World War II in Europe. His performance in Poland earned him recognition and promotion, and he was subsequently assigned to similar duties during the invasion of France in 1940. However, it was on the Eastern Front that Fegelein would achieve both his greatest military success and his most damning criminal involvement. In 1941, as Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, Fegelein commanded the SS Cavalry Brigade, a unit that would become notorious for its participation in mass murders of civilians, particularly Jews, in the occupied territories of the Western Soviet Union. The SS Cavalry Brigade under Fegelein's command was involved in brutal anti-partisan operations that were, in reality, often pretexts for the systematic murder of Jewish civilians and other groups deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. In August 1941, in the Pripyat Marshes region of what is now Belarus, Fegelein's units participated in mass shootings that killed thousands of people, overwhelmingly civilians including women, children, and elderly people. The brigade's official reports, signed by Fegelein himself, documented these killings with bureaucratic precision, often characterizing the victims as partisans or looters, when they were in fact ordinary civilians guilty of nothing more than being Jewish or suspected of opposing German occupation. These actions were not aberrations or the unauthorized excesses of subordinates. They were part of the systematic implementation of Nazi genocidal policies, and Fegelein's command responsibility for them is well documented in surviving military records. Despite, or perhaps because of, his involvement in these atrocities, Fegelein continued to advance within the SS hierarchy. He received the Iron Cross First Class and other military decorations for his actions on the Eastern Front, and he was promoted to the rank of SS Standartenführer, equivalent to colonel, in 1943. His success on the battlefield and his growing reputation as an aggressive and effective officer brought him to the attention of Heinrich Himmler personally. More significantly for his personal life, his presence at the Berghof during periods of leave brought him into close contact with Eva Braun and her circle, including her sister Gretl. The exact timeline of Hermann Fegelein's courtship of Eva Braun is somewhat unclear, but by 1944 their relationship had developed to the point where marriage was being discussed. Hitler himself became involved in facilitating the union, apparently viewing it as a useful connection that would further bind Fegelein to his inner circle. The wedding of Gretl Braun and Hermann Fegelein took place on June 3, 1944, at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. It was an elaborate affair despite the increasingly desperate military situation facing Germany in the summer of 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy would begin just 3 days later, marking the opening of the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. But at the Berghof in early June, the atmosphere was one of forced celebration. Hitler attended the wedding ceremony and reception, serving as the primary sponsor and giving the couple his blessing. Eva Braun was overjoyed that her beloved younger sister was marrying, and she helped organize the festivities and ensured that Gretl had an appropriately lavish wedding despite wartime restrictions. Other high-ranking Nazis and their wives attended, making the event a gathering of the regime's elite at a time when the war was increasingly turning against Germany. Gretl wore a white wedding gown and carried a bouquet of flowers as she exchanged vows with the SS officer, who had impressed her with his charm and his apparent influence within the Nazi hierarchy. The marriage initially seemed to promise Gretl a secure and privileged position. Fegelein continued to hold important posts within the SS, and his connection to Hitler through his marriage to Eva Braun's sister gave him enhanced access to the dictator's inner circle. By late 1944, Fegelein had been appointed as Himmler's liaison officer to Hitler's headquarters, a position that placed him in regular contact with the Führer and gave him insider knowledge of military and political developments at the highest level of the Nazi regime. He was promoted to SS Gruppenführer, equivalent to Major General, a remarkable rise for someone who had been a show jumper just over a decade earlier. Gretl, meanwhile, settled into the role of an SS officer's wife, enjoying the material privileges that came with her husband's rank and connections, while remaining largely ignorant of, or willfully blind to, the crimes in which he had participated and continued to participate through his association with Himmler and the SS command structure. The final months of the war would bring Gretl's brief marriage to a shocking and violent conclusion, but in late 1944 she discovered that she was pregnant. The news was welcomed by both Hermann and Gretl, and Eva Braun was reportedly thrilled at the prospect of becoming an aunt. The pregnancy proceeded normally through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, even as Germany's military situation became increasingly hopeless. Allied forces advanced from both east and west. German cities were reduced to rubble by strategic bombing, and the Nazi regime began its, final death throes. Through it all, Gretl remained pregnant and relatively protected, residing in Bavaria, while her husband shuttled between various headquarters and the Führer bunker in Berlin, where Hitler had taken up residence in January 1945. What happened next would transform Gretl from a privileged member of the Nazi elite into a widow struggling to survive in the chaos of defeated Germany. In late April 1945, as Soviet forces encircled Berlin and the end of the Third Reich became inevitable, Hermann Fegelein found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. He had been serving as Himmler's representative at Hitler's bunker headquarters, shuttling between the underground complex and other locations to maintain communication between the Reichsführer SS and the Führer. But by mid-April, Himmler had begun his own unauthorized attempts to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies through intermediaries, betraying Hitler in the dictator's final days. Whether Fegelein was aware of the full extent of Himmler's treachery is unclear, but he certainly knew that the situation was collapsing and that remaining in Berlin was increasingly suicidal. On April 26, 1945, Fegelein disappeared from the bunker without permission, attempting to flee the doomed city. He did not tell his wife Gretl, who was heavily pregnant in Bavaria, about his plans or his departure. He simply vanished from his post, an act of desertion at the worst possible moment. Hitler's staff discovered Fegelein's absence on April 27th and immediately began searching for him. They found him at his apartment in Berlin, apparently preparing to escape the city or possibly already hiding there. Various accounts suggest that he was drunk when discovered and that he had been in contact with people attempting to broker deals with the advancing Allies. More damagingly, there were indications that he had been trying to convert his assets into portable forms and was planning to flee to a neutral country. When brought back to the bunker for questioning, Fegelein faced Hitler's fury at what the dictator viewed as a personal betrayal. The fact that Fegelein was married to Eva Braun's sister made his desertion seem even more treacherous to Hitler, who prided himself on the loyalty of his inner circle. The interrogation of Fegelein revealed, or was claimed to have revealed, that he had knowledge of Himmler's unauthorized peace negotiations, though whether Fegelein had actually known the full extent of Himmler's actions, or whether this knowledge was extracted through coercion or simply assumed by Hitler's paranoid inner circle, remains unclear from conflicting accounts. Eva Braun herself intervened on her brother-in-law's behalf, pleading with Hitler to spare Fegelein's life for the sake of her sister and the unborn child. This put Eva in an impossible position, torn between her loyalty to Hitler and her love for her sister. Hitler initially seemed inclined toward leniency, or at least delay, possibly out of consideration for Eva, or possibly because even he recognized the difficulty of executing a man whose wife was the sister of the woman he had just married. But the discovery of further evidence of Himmler's betrayal, including his attempts to negotiate with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross, hardened Hitler's resolve. On April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's own death and 1 day before his marriage to Eva, Hermann Fegelein was stripped of his rank and decorations in a summary court-martial held in the bunker. He was then taken to the Reich Chancellery Garden and executed by firing squad on Hitler's direct orders. He was 38 years old and had been married to Gretl Braun for less than 11 months. The news of Fegelein's execution was kept from Gretl initially, though Eva must have known of her brother-in-law's fate before she herself died on April 30th. Whether Eva was able to send any message to her sister before taking the cyanide capsule alongside Hitler is unknown. Gretl, heavily pregnant and residing in Bavaria, first learned of the chaotic events in Berlin through fragmentary radio reports and rumours that circulated in the final days of April and early May 1945. The initial reports focused on Hitler's death and the surrender of Berlin to Soviet forces on May 2, 1945. Only gradually did the full story emerge of the bunker's final days, including the execution of Hermann Fegelein and the subsequent suicides of Hitler and Eva. For Gretl, the shock was devastating and multifaceted. She had lost her husband to execution, her sister to suicide, and she faced the prospect of giving birth to a child who would be fatherless and whose father's name was now associated with war crimes and desertion. On May 5th, 1945, just 5 days after Hitler and Eva's deaths, and 7 days after Hermann Fegelein's execution, Gretl gave birth to a daughter at a hospital in Bavaria. She named the baby Eva Barbara Fegelein, honouring her dead sister with the first name and giving the child her father's surname despite the taint it now carried. The birth should have been a joyous occasion, but it was instead marked by grief, trauma and fear about the future. Germany had surrendered unconditionally on May 7th and May 8th, 1945, and the country was now occupied by Allied forces who were beginning the massive task of arresting Nazi officials, documenting war crimes, and implementing denazification procedures. Gretl, as the widow of an SS general and the sister of Eva Braun, was certain to face scrutiny from the occupying authorities. She had no husband to protect her, no financial resources beyond what she had managed to save or hide, and an infant daughter to care for in a country devastated by war and facing an uncertain future. American authorities detained Gretl Fegelein for questioning in June 1945, separating her temporarily from her infant daughter who was left in the care of relatives or possibly hospital staff. The interrogations focused on her knowledge of her husband's activities, her sister's relationship with Hitler, and her own involvement with or knowledge of Nazi crimes. Gretl's testimony painted a picture of a woman who had been more concerned with domesticity and social activities than with politics or military affairs. She claimed to have known little of Hermann's wartime actions beyond the general fact that he was an SS officer, and she denied any knowledge of the atrocities in which his units had participated. Whether this ignorance was genuine or a convenient fiction is difficult to determine. It was certainly possible for wives to remain unaware of the specific crimes their husbands committed, particularly when those crimes were committed in distant territories and were not discussed at home. But it strains credulity to suggest that Gretl, who had married a high-ranking SS officer and who had lived among the Nazi elite at the Berghof, had no inkling whatsoever of the regime's murderous policies. Regarding her sister Eva's relationship with Hitler, Gretl provided American interrogators with details about life at the Berghof and Eva's role there. She described her sister as someone who avoided political discussions and preferred to focus on entertainment, sports, and social activities. Gretl confirmed what other sources had indicated, that Eva had been kept deliberately isolated from official functions and had lived in a strange twilight world where she enjoyed material comfort but lacked any official recognition or status. Gretl also spoke about the final time she had seen her sister, which was sometime in early April 1945, before Eva departed for Berlin. According to Gretl's account, Eva had been determined to join Hitler in the bunker despite the obvious dangers, and she had seemed resigned to whatever fate awaited her there. This determination had worried Gretl, who was pregnant and focused on her own impending motherhood, but Eva had been adamant that she would not abandon Hitler in his final days. The denazification authorities faced a complicated decision regarding Gretl Fegelein. On one hand, she was the widow of a war criminal and the sister of Hitler's companion, connections that suggested deep involvement with the Nazi regime. On the other hand, she had not been a party member herself, had held no official position, and there was no evidence that she had personally participated in or directly benefited from war crimes beyond the general privilege of her social position. After several months of investigation and detention, Gretl was classified as a Mitläufer, a fellow traveller, the same category that had been applied to her father, Fritz Braun. This classification meant she faced relatively minor consequences. She was required to pay a fine, which was difficult given her limited financial resources, and she was prohibited from certain types of employment, though as a young mother these restrictions were less burdensome than they would have been for someone seeking to resume a professional career. Released from detention in late 1945 or early 1946, Gretl faced the challenge of rebuilding her life in a devastated Germany with an infant daughter and a toxic surname. The name Fegelein had become notorious due to Hermann's execution by Hitler and the subsequent revelation of his war crimes. Gretl initially retained the name, perhaps out of a sense that it was her daughter's birthright, or perhaps because the bureaucratic process of changing it seemed overwhelming in the chaos of post-war Germany. She moved in with her parents, Fritz and Fanny Braun, in Munich, returning to the family home where she had grown up. This arrangement provided her with essential support in caring for her daughter, but it also meant living under the same roof as her parents, who were themselves struggling with the aftermath of Eva's death and their own denazification proceedings. The household was marked by a heavy silence about the past. The Brauns did not discuss Eva's suicide or Hermann's execution in any detail, at least not in front of young Eva Barbara, and they avoided speaking about the war years or their connections to Hitler. Gretl's attempts to find work were hampered by her surname and her family history. Potential employers were wary of hiring someone with such notorious connections, and the denazification restrictions limited her options further. She took whatever work she could find, often menial jobs that paid poorly, but asked few questions about her background. The economic situation in occupied Germany was dire in the immediate post-war years, with widespread shortages of food, housing, and basic necessities. The Marshall Plan and subsequent economic reforms would eventually spark Germany's remarkable economic recovery. But in 1946 and 1947, the country was still struggling with the immediate aftermath of total defeat. Gretl, like millions of other Germans, faced rationing, black market dealings for essentials, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. Her situation was complicated by the fact that she was trying to raise a child in these conditions, and the child bore the surname of an executed war criminal. As Eva Barbara Fegelein grew from infancy to childhood, Gretl faced increasingly difficult questions about what to tell her daughter about her father and her family history. How does one explain to a child that her father was executed by Adolf Hitler just days before her birth? How does one convey that her father had commanded units responsible for mass murders, that her aunt Eva had been Hitler's companion and had died by suicide alongside him in a bunker? Gretl chose a path of selective disclosure and protective deception. To young Eva Barbara, she presented a simplified and sanitized version of events. Hermann Fegelein had been a soldier who died in the war, a victim of the chaotic final days rather than someone executed for desertion and treason. Eva Braun had been a woman who tragically died at the war's end, with the details of her relationship with Hitler and her suicide left vague and unexplained. This approach was partly motivated by a desire to protect her daughter from painful truths, and partly by the hope that the past could somehow be left behind if it was not constantly discussed. In 1954, Gretl made a decision that would significantly change her circumstances. She married Kurt Berlinghoff, a businessman who was willing to accept her despite her notorious family connections. The marriage provided Gretl with financial security and social respectability that had been largely absent from her life since Hermann Fegelein's death. More importantly for her daughter, the marriage offered the possibility of a fresh start. Kurt Berlinghoff was willing to adopt Eva Barbara and give her his surname, removing the stigma of the Fegelein name that had marked the child's early years. Eva Barbara Fegelein became Eva Barbara Berlinghoff, a transformation that was both bureaucratic and psychological. With a new surname and a stepfather who was not connected to the Nazi regime, the young girl could potentially escape some of the burden of her biological heritage. Gretl herself took her new husband's name, becoming Gretl Berlinghoff, and leaving behind the surname that had connected her to her executed first husband. The marriage appears to have been reasonably successful by the standards of the time. Kurt Berlinghoff provided for his new family, and Gretl finally achieved some of the domestic stability and conventional respectability that had eluded her since Hermann Fegelein's death. They did not have children together, so Eva Barbara remained Gretl's only child. The family lived quietly in Munich, avoiding publicity and maintaining a low profile. Kurt Berlinghoff's business interests, which remain somewhat obscure in historical records but appear to have been in commerce or manufacturing, benefited from West Germany's economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s. The family was able to afford a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, far removed from the deprivation of the immediate post-war years, but also far removed from the luxury and privilege that Gretl had briefly enjoyed as Hermann Fegelein's wife and Eva Braun's sister. However, Gretl's health began to decline in the late 1960s. The exact nature of her illness is not clearly documented in accessible records, but she appears to have suffered from cancer or another serious degenerative disease. The years of stress, trauma, and the burden of her family history may have taken their toll, though of course illness requires no such explanation. Gretl Braun Fegelein Berlinghoff died on October 10, 1987 in Munich at the age of 72. Her death occurred just months after another significant death that had affected her daughter and the broader question of the Braun family legacy. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, whose wife Ilsa had been mentioned in connection with post-war Nazi support networks, had died in Spandau prison in August 1987, marking the end of an era. Gretl's death was noted in brief obituaries that mentioned her connection to Eva Braun and to Adolf Hitler, but she had succeeded in living most of her adult life away from intense public scrutiny. She had raised her daughter, remarried, and found some measure of peace, though the shadows of 1945 never entirely lifted. Eva Barbara Fegelein, later Berlinghoff, grew up in the 1950s and 1960s as part of the generation of Germans who had no personal memory of the Third Reich, but who inherited its legacy nonetheless. Born on May 5, 1945, she entered the world at the precise moment when Nazi Germany was collapsing into final defeat. Her birth, occurring just days after her father's execution and her aunt Eva's suicide, seemed almost symbolic of the transition from the Third Reich to the post-war era. As a child, Eva Barbara was shielded from much of the truth about her family history. Her mother Gretl and her grandparents, the elder Brauns, maintained a protective silence about the details of the past. She knew that her aunt Eva had been connected to Adolf Hitler, but the full nature of that connection and the circumstances of Eva's death were not explained to her in childhood. She knew that her biological father had died in the war, but not that he had been executed by Hitler or that he had commanded units involved in mass murders. The truth began to emerge as Eva Barbara entered adolescence and young adulthood. By the 1960s, an enormous volume of historical scholarship, memoir literature, and popular accounts of the Third Reich had been published. The Nuremberg trials, the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, and numerous other legal proceedings had documented the crimes of the Nazi regime in exhaustive detail. In this environment of increasing historical awareness and moral reckoning with the past, it became impossible to maintain the protective fictions that had shielded Eva Barbara's childhood. She learned that her aunt Eva had not merely been connected to Hitler, but had been his longtime companion, and had married him hours before their joint suicide. She learned that her father had been an SS officer implicated in atrocities on the Eastern Front, and had been executed for desertion in the bunker's final days. These revelations were deeply traumatic for a young woman who was trying to establish her own identity and build her own life. Eva Barbara's response to learning the full truth about her family history was to retreat further into privacy. Unlike some children of Nazi officials who became public advocates for confronting the past or who wrote memoirs explaining their experiences, Eva Barbara chose silence. She completed her education, though the details of her schooling are not well documented, and she appears to have pursued a conventional career path that kept her out of the public eye. There are suggestions in various sources that she worked in business or administration, but the specifics remain vague, likely by her own design. She married a man whose identity has been largely kept private, continuing her pattern of avoiding publicity. The marriage produced at least one child, making Eva Barbara's offspring the great-grandchildren of Fritz and Fanny Braun, and the great-nieces or great-nephews of Eva Braun. Whether these descendants know the full details of their family history or whether they too have been shielded from some of the more disturbing facts is unknown. Throughout her adult life, Eva Barbara has maintained an iron control over her privacy. She has given no interviews to journalists or historians, has not participated in documentaries about the Third Reich or about Eva Braun, and has avoided any public discussion of her family history. This reticence is understandable given the nature of that history. What could she possibly say that would satisfy public curiosity without causing herself and her family further pain? How could she discuss her father's war crimes or her aunt's relationship with Hitler without either seeming to defend the indefensible or to condemn family members whom she never knew personally? Her silence has been both a shield and a burden, protecting her privacy, but also leaving questions unanswered about how the descendants of those closest to Hitler have processed their inheritance. Eva Barbara has lived into the 21st century, witnessing the transformation of Germany from the occupied, divided country of her childhood to the reunified, prosperous democracy of today. She has seen the Third Reich recede from living memory into history, as the generation that lived through it has died off, and new generations have emerged with no personal connection to those events. The question of Eva Barbara's relationship with her family's past raises broader questions about inheritance, guilt, and identity. She bears no personal responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi regime or for the choices her father and aunt made. She was born after those crimes were committed and those choices were made, an infant with no agency in the events that would define her family history. Yet she carries the genetic and nominal connection to people who were intimately involved with one of history's greatest evils. This is the burden of what Germans call Sippenhaft, the idea of clan liability or guilt by association, a concept that the Nazis themselves ironically employed against the families of those they deemed enemies. How does one live with such a heritage? How does one build an identity that acknowledges the past without being entirely defined by it? Eva Barbara's solution has been to withdraw from public life, to guard her privacy fiercely, and to live as normal a life as possible, given the extraordinary circumstances of her birth. Whether this approach has brought her peace, or whether she remains haunted by questions and judgments she can never fully escape, is known only to her and those closest to her. Beyond the immediate family of Eva Braun, her parents, her sisters, and her niece, there were other relatives whose lives were also touched by the association with Hitler and the Third Reich. The extended Braun family, including cousins, aunts, uncles, and more distant relations, all found themselves carrying a tainted surname after the war. Some of these extended family members had never met Eva or had only the most peripheral connection to her life with Hitler, yet they too faced questions and suspicions simply because they shared her last name. The surname Braun is common in Germany, and most people bearing it have no connection whatsoever to Eva Braun's family. But for those who were actually related to her, the connection was inescapable. Some chose to emphasize their distance from Eva and her choices, making clear in social and professional contexts that while they shared a surname and perhaps some distant genealogical connection, they had not been part of her life at the Berghof or her circle around Hitler. Others simply avoided discussing the connection at all, hoping that the commonness of the surname would provide cover. One aspect of the Braun family story that has received less attention in historical accounts is the question of what happened to Eva's personal belongings, photographs, and documents after her death. Eva had been an enthusiastic photographer and had taken thousands of photographs during her years with Hitler, documenting life at the Berghof, social gatherings, Hitler at leisure, and her own life. She also kept diaries, though these were fragmentary rather than comprehensive journals. After her death, these materials became scattered. Some were seized by Allied forces who recognized their historical value. Others were taken by bunker survivors or by people who had access to Eva's apartments in Munich and at the Berghof in the chaotic final days of the war. Still others presumably remained with the Braun family, particularly items that had been stored at the family home in Munich rather than at Eva's own residences. The disposition of these materials became a source of controversy and litigation in the post-war years. Fritz and Fanny Braun, as Eva's closest surviving relatives, had some claim to her personal effects, but the historical and financial value of materials connected to Hitler complicated matters enormously. Photographs of Hitler at leisure, showing him in informal settings with Eva and members of his inner circle, had significant monetary value to collectors and publications. Diaries or letters that might shed light on Hitler's personality or private life were of interest to historians and journalists. The West German government, and later the unified German government, maintained restrictions on the commercial exploitation of Nazi materials, attempting to prevent the glorification of Hitler and the Third Reich. This created a legal and ethical minefield around Eva's belongings. Who owned them? Who had the right to publish them or profit from them? Should they be suppressed entirely or made available to scholars? These questions were never entirely resolved, and materials from Eva's collection continue to emerge occasionally, usually through private sales or estate distributions that bring them to public attention decades after the war. The Braun family's relationship with these materials appears to have been ambivalent. On one hand, photographs and documents connected to Eva had monetary value that could have helped the family in the difficult post-war years. On the other hand, publicizing or selling such materials would draw attention to the family and force them to engage with the past in ways they preferred to avoid. Some materials were sold discreetly through intermediaries, providing income without requiring direct family involvement in negotiations or publicity. Other materials were retained either out of sentimental attachment or in the hope that their value would increase over time. Still, others may have been destroyed, particularly items that the family found too painful to keep or too dangerous to have discovered by authorities who might view them as evidence of Nazi sympathies. The fragmentary survival of Eva's personal archive reflects these competing impulses of preservation, profit, and protective destruction. In the decades since the war, various individuals have come forward claiming to possess materials from Eva Braun's collection or claiming previously unknown connections to the Braun family. Some of these claims have proven legitimate, revealing genuinely unknown photographs or documents. Others have been exposed as forgeries or exaggerations, attempts to profit from the continuing fascination with Hitler and his inner circle. The Braun family has generally declined to authenticate or reject these claims publicly, maintaining their silence even when materials allegedly from Eva's collection appear at auction or in publications. This refusal to engage has sometimes allowed forgeries to circulate unchallenged, but it has also protected the family from being drawn into controversies and legal disputes. The question of what authentic materials from Eva's collection still exist in private hands, possibly still held by the Braun family or their descendants, remains open. The transformation of Germany from the Third Reich to the Federal Republic and eventually to the reunified nation of today has meant that each generation of the Braun family has experienced a different relationship with the past. For Fritz and Fanny Braun, who lived through both World Wars and the Third Reich, the Nazi period was lived experience that they had to process and survive. They had known Hitler personally, had benefited from their daughter's relationship with him, and had to reckon with the consequences of that connection in the war's aftermath. They chose a strategy of minimal engagement, neither defending nor condemning, simply trying to live out their remaining years in peace. For their daughters Ilsa and Gretl, the Nazi period was also lived experience, but from a different perspective. They had been young women during Hitler's rise and rule, old enough to make choices, but young enough that those choices were constrained by family loyalty and social pressure. Their post-war lives were shaped by those earlier choices and by their relationships with Eva, but they had decades to construct new identities apart from those wartime associations. For Eva Barbara Fegelein, later Berlinghoff, the Third Reich was not lived experience, but inheritance. She was born at the moment of the regime's collapse and grew up in a Germany that was trying simultaneously to forget and to confront its Nazi past. Her generation, sometimes called the second generation, had to grapple with the crimes their parents' generation had committed or tolerated, without having participated in those crimes themselves. They faced questions about collective guilt, about the possibility of redemption, and about how to be German in the shadow of the Holocaust. Eva Barbara's position was particularly acute because her family's connection to Hitler was so intimate and personal. She could not claim the distance that many Germans maintained, the assertion that their families had been merely passive or had actively opposed the regime. Her aunt had loved Hitler and died with him. Her father had served in the SS and commanded units that murdered civilians. There was no whitewashing these facts, no way to claim that her family had been innocent bystanders to Nazi crimes. The third generation, Eva Barbara's children, represents yet another relationship with this past. They are the great-grandchildren of people who knew Hitler personally, but they live in a Germany that is now several generations removed from the Third Reich. For them, Hitler and the Nazi period are increasingly matters of history rather than family memory, though the family connection remains. Whether they feel burdened by this heritage, or whether enough time has passed that they can view it with some detachment, is unknowable, given their privacy. The passage of time has allowed some distance, but it has not erased the basic facts of their genealogy. They are descended from Eva Braun's sister, making them blood relations of Hitler's companion, and that fact will remain part of their family history regardless of how many generations separate them from the events of 1945. In the broader context of post-war Germany, the Braun family's experience reflects patterns seen in many families that were connected to the Nazi regime. There was an initial period of denazification and consequence, varying in severity depending on the individual's level of involvement. This was followed by a long period of silence, what Germans call the Wirtschaftswunder years, when the focus was on economic recovery and rebuilding rather than moral reckoning with the past. The 1960s brought a new wave of confrontation with Nazi crimes, driven partly by trials like the Eichmann case and partly by the younger generation demanding answers from their parents. The 1980s and 1990s saw further intensification of historical scholarship and public memorialization. And the 21st century has brought yet another evolution, as the last survivors of the Third Reich die, and the period becomes entirely a matter of historical memory rather than lived experience. Throughout each of these periods, the Braun family adapted their relationship with the past to fit the prevailing social and cultural norms. In the immediate post-war years, silence and denial were common. By the 1960s, some degree of acknowledgement became necessary. In later decades, the expectation emerged that families connected to the Nazi regime should actively engage with the past and demonstrate their understanding of its moral dimensions. The Braun family's consistent pattern has been minimal engagement, neither actively defending their relatives' choices nor publicly condemning them, simply maintaining privacy and avoiding the spotlight. This approach has been successful in allowing the family to live relatively normal lives. But it has also meant that important historical questions about Eva Braun, her relationship with Hitler, and the dynamics of life in his inner circle remain partially unanswered. One of the persistent questions about the Braun family is the extent to which they profited from Eva's relationship with Hitler and whether they ever returned or accounted for those benefits. It is well documented that Hitler provided Eva with generous monthly allowances and that he ensured she lived in comfort and luxury. Some of this money undoubtedly flowed to her family, whether through direct gifts, through Eva sharing her resources with her sisters and parents, or through opportunities that Hitler arranged for family members. Fritz Braun's employment, whatever its exact nature, appears to have been facilitated by Hitler's influence. The family's social position and access to scarce goods during the war years were enhanced by their connection to the Führer. The denazification fines imposed on Fritz and Gretl represented a modest attempt to claw back some of these benefits, but they were hardly comprehensive accounting for all the family had received. The question of whether more should have been demanded of them or whether the relatively lenient treatment they received was appropriate given their level of personal involvement remains debated among historians. Another dimension of the Braun family story that deserves examination is the gender dynamics at play in how they were treated by post-war authorities and by history. Eva Braun, Ilsa Braun, Gretl Fegelein and Fanny Braun were all women living in a deeply patriarchal society where women were expected to support their husbands and defer to male authority. The question of how much agency Eva had in her relationship with Hitler, or how much choice Gretl had in remaining married to Hermann Fegelein, given the social constraints of the 1940s, is complex. The denazification authorities largely accepted the premise that these women had been politically passive, focused on domestic concerns rather than party ideology or military affairs. This assumption may have been partially true, but it also conveniently allowed male authorities to avoid fully reckoning with women's complicity in the Nazi regime. Women who had enthusiastically supported Nazism, who had benefited from its policies, or who had been willfully ignorant of its crimes were often treated more leniently than men in comparable positions, reflecting gendered assumptions about women's political agency and responsibility. The Braun women certainly benefited from these gendered assumptions. Eva was frequently portrayed by early biographers and historians as a shallow, apolitical woman concerned only with fashion and entertainment, an image that minimized her complicity in Hitler's regime by suggesting she was too frivolous to understand what was happening. Gretl was similarly presented as a victim of circumstances, married to an SS officer, but ignorant of his crimes. These portrayals allowed both women and their surviving family members to avoid fuller accounting for their roles, however peripheral, in supporting and enabling the Nazi regime. More recent historical scholarship has begun to question these gendered assumptions and to explore the ways in which women participated in and benefited from Nazism, even when they held no official positions. This revisionist approach suggests that the Braun women's complicity may have been greater than their denazification classifications suggested, though it remains true that their power and influence were far less than those of the male Nazi leaders. The psychological impact of their family history on the Braun descendants is another area that has received limited scholarly attention, largely because the family has maintained such strict privacy. How does one psychologically process being descended from Eva Braun? What does it mean for one's sense of identity to know that one's grandmother or aunt chose to die with Hitler, that one's grandfather commanded SS units involved in atrocities, that one's family name is forever linked with the Third Reich? Mental health professionals who work with descendants of Nazi perpetrators have identified common patterns of response to this kind of traumatic historical inheritance. Some descendants experience profound shame and guilt despite bearing no personal responsibility for the crimes. Others develop defensive reactions, either minimizing their ancestors' involvement or arguing that they were victims of circumstances. Still others become actively engaged with confronting the past, working in Holocaust education or related fields as a form of restitution or personal reckoning. The Braun family's apparent pattern of withdrawal and silence suggests they fall into the first or second category, either burdened by shame or defensively minimizing the significance of their connection to Hitler. The legal and ethical questions surrounding materials from Eva Braun's estate have continued to emerge periodically over the decades since her death. In 2010, a collection of Eva's letters sold at auction for significant sums, raising questions about who had the right to profit from such materials and whether they should have been in private hands at all. The letters included correspondence between Eva and her family, providing insights into her personality and her relationship with Hitler. Some family members reportedly opposed the sale, though they did not mount a legal challenge to prevent it. The auction house argued that the letters had significant historical value and that making them available to scholars and the public served the important purpose of illuminating a dark period of history. Critics countered that profiting from materials connected to Hitler and the Third Reich was morally problematic, and that the letters should have been donated to a museum or archive rather than sold to the highest bidder. Similar controversies have erupted over photographs from Eva's collection, films she shot at the Berghof, and various personal items that periodically appear at auctions or in private collections. The German government has attempted to discourage the commercialization of Nazi memorabilia through legal restrictions and public pressure, but the private market for such materials remains robust. Collectors in Germany and abroad are willing to pay substantial sums for items connected to Hitler and his inner circle, creating financial incentives for those who possess such materials to sell them. The Braun family has been implicated in some of these sales, either directly or through intermediaries, though they have generally not commented publicly on their involvement. The ethics of profiting from Eva Braun's belongings more than 70 years after her death remain contested, with some arguing that enough time has passed that they should be treated like any other historical materials, while others maintain that anything connected to Hitler and the Nazi regime deserves special restrictions. The question of how Eva Braun herself should be remembered and understood has evolved over the decades since her death. Early portrayals tended to present her as either a tragic figure, a woman who loved the wrong man and paid the ultimate price, or as a frivolous non-entity, someone too shallow and apolitical to deserve serious historical attention. Both of these portrayals served to minimize her significance and her complicity, treating her as a footnote to Hitler's story rather than an actor in her own right. More recent historical work has attempted to understand Eva as a more complex figure, someone who made choices within the constraints available to her, who benefited enormously from her relationship with Hitler, and who demonstrated loyalty to him that enabled and supported his regime, even if she did not directly participate in its crimes. This more nuanced understanding recognizes that while Eva held no official power and committed no war crimes personally, her choice to remain with Hitler, to manage his household, to present a veneer of domestic normalcy for the Nazi elite, and to ultimately die with him were all actions that had moral dimensions and historical consequences. For Eva's surviving family members, the evolution in how she is remembered has meant constantly shifting expectations about how they should relate to her memory. In the immediate post-war period, distancing themselves from Eva was the prudent course. Acknowledging the relationship but minimizing its significance allowed the family to pass through denazification with minimal consequences. As time passed and historical interest in Hitler's private life grew, the family found themselves periodically approached by journalists, authors, and filmmakers seeking information about Eva. Their general refusal to cooperate with these inquiries meant that much of what has been written about Eva comes from sources outside the family. From the testimony of Hitler's staff, from documents captured by Allied forces, and from Eva's own photographs and fragmentary diaries. The family's silence has thus shaped Eva's historical image by default, allowing others to define her and her significance without family input or correction. This dynamic has occasionally frustrated historians who believe that the Braun family, particularly Ilsa during her lifetime and potentially Gretl before her death, possessed information and insights that would have been valuable for understanding Eva and the inner workings of Hitler's household. What did Eva say about Hitler in private? Conversations with her sisters? What were her real feelings about being kept hidden from public view? Did she know about the Holocaust and the other crimes being committed in Germany's name? And if so, how did she reconcile this knowledge with her love for Hitler? These questions might have been answered, or at least better illuminated, by testimony from family members who knew Eva intimately. Their refusal to provide such testimony, understandable though it is from the perspective of protecting their own privacy and avoiding painful subjects, has left gaps in the historical record that may never be filled. The last people who knew Eva as a sister and daughter rather than as Hitler's companion are now dead, and with them went whatever insights they might have shared about her inner life and motivations. The Braun family's experience also raises questions about the nature of historical guilt and responsibility that extend beyond their particular case. To what extent should family members of historical villains be held accountable for the crimes of their relatives? Should descendants bear a burden of acknowledgement or restitution for benefits their ancestors received from evil regimes? These questions are not unique to the Braun family or to Nazi Germany. They arise in many historical contexts where families benefited from slavery, colonialism, dictatorship, or other forms of systematic oppression and exploitation. The general consensus in liberal democratic societies is that individuals should not be held legally responsible for crimes they did not personally commit, regardless of family relationship. This principle protects descendants of Nazi officials and collaborators from prosecution for their ancestors' crimes. However, there is often an expectation of moral acknowledgement, a recognition that ancestors did wrong and that descendants benefit from honestly confronting this past, rather than denying or minimizing it. The Braun family has largely avoided this moral acknowledgement in public forums, though what private conversations or reckonings have occurred within the family is unknown. Their strategy of silence and privacy has allowed them to avoid both the legal consequences that might have come from more active defense of their relatives and the moral pressure that comes from public acknowledgement. This middle path has been sustainable, but has also left them in a kind of historical limbo, neither condemned nor absolved, simply existing in the shadow of events they did not cause but from which they cannot escape. The passage of time has made this position easier to maintain. As the generation with living memory of the Third Reich has died off, the intensity of public interest in the details of Nazi leaders' personal lives has diminished somewhat, though it has never entirely disappeared. The Braun family name no longer generates the immediate recognition and controversy it once did, particularly among younger Germans who have no personal connection to the war years. Nevertheless, periodic reminders emerge that the past is never entirely past. When films or television series about Hitler and the Third Reich are produced, Eva Braun usually appears as a character, and the Braun family finds itself once again linked to these portrayals. Some of these dramatizations have been more sympathetic to Eva than others, presenting her as a victim of her own naivety or of Hitler's manipulation. Others have portrayed her more critically, as someone who chose comfort and luxury over moral responsibility and who enabled Hitler's crimes through her loyalty and support. The family has generally not commented on these portrayals, perhaps recognizing that any engagement would only draw more attention to their connection with Eva and Hitler. The question of whether dramatic portrayals of historical figures require the consent or consultation of surviving family members is complex, balancing creative freedom and historical education against privacy and the potential for harm to descendants. In Eva's case, the historical significance and public interest in Hitler's personal life has generally been judged to outweigh any claims to privacy the family might assert. Comparing the Braun family's post-war trajectory with that of other families connected to the Nazi elite reveals both commonalities and divergences. The families of executed Nazi leaders face challenges similar to those confronted by Gretl Fegelein after Hermann's execution. The widows and children of men hanged at Nuremberg or executed elsewhere had to navigate a society that viewed their surnames as markers of infamy. Some of these families changed their names to escape the association, while others retained them and attempted to rehabilitate their relatives' reputations. The Hess family, particularly Wolf Hess, Rudolf's son, became vocal defenders of his father and worked tirelessly to portray him as a peace advocate rather than a war or criminal. The Göring family took a different approach, with Edda Göring maintaining a much lower profile than Wolf Hess, though she never entirely repudiated her father either. The Frank family saw dramatic divergence, with Nicholas Frank becoming one of the most vocal and harsh critics of his father's crimes, publishing books that condemned Hans Frank in the strongest possible terms. The Braun family's approach falls somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. They have not become vocal defenders of Eva or Hermann Fegelein, which would be morally indefensible and socially untenable. Neither have they become public critics or repudiators of their relatives, which would require a level of engagement with the past and with public discourse that they have consistently avoided. Instead, they have chosen a path of private acknowledgement and public silence, neither defending nor condemning, simply trying to live their lives apart from a history they cannot change. This approach may lack the dramatic quality of the Hess or Frank family stories, but it represents a valid and perhaps more common response to the burden of historical guilt. Most people are neither heroes nor villains in confronting difficult family histories. They are simply trying to find a way to live with circumstances they did not choose and cannot escape. The geographic context of the Braun family's post-war life is also worth considering. They remained in Munich, the city where Eva had been born and raised, where she had met Hitler, and where the Nazi Party had its deepest roots. Munich was the site of Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923, the location of the Braun house that served as Nazi Party headquarters, and the place where Hitler maintained an apartment until the end of the war. It was deeply implicated in the history of Nazism in ways that made it both a difficult and an appropriate place for the Braun family to remain. On one hand, Munich was full of people who had supported the Nazi Party and who might view the Brauns with a mixture of nostalgia and sympathy. On the other hand, it was also a place where the consequences of Nazism were starkly visible in the bombed-out buildings, the displaced persons camps, and the ongoing trials of Nazi criminals. The Brauns could have chosen to relocate to a different city or even a different country where their surname would not carry the same weight. That they remained in Munich suggests a complex relationship with the city and its Nazi past, perhaps a desire to maintain roots and community despite the difficulties, or perhaps a recognition that they could not truly escape their history regardless of where they went. The economic dimension of the Braun family's post-war experience deserves further exploration. The immediate post-war years in Germany were marked by severe economic hardship, with widespread unemployment, currency instability, and shortages of basic necessities. The Brauns entered this environment having lost the privileged position they had enjoyed during Eva's relationship with Hitler. They were no longer connected to power, and no longer had access to the material benefits that connection had provided. Fritz Braun's ability to resume teaching work was economically crucial for the family's survival, and the denazification fines, while relatively modest, represented a significant burden in the austere conditions of 1946 and 1947. Gretl's situation was even more precarious as a young widow with an infant daughter and limited employment prospects. Her eventual remarriage to Kurt Berlinghoff provided economic security that would have been difficult to achieve on her own, given the constraints she faced. As West Germany's economy recovered and the Wirtschaftswunder or economic miracle took hold in the 1950s and 1960s, the Braun family benefited along with millions of other Germans. The material prosperity that characterized West Germany in these decades allowed them to achieve a comfortable, middle-class existence that would have seemed impossible in the immediate post-war years. This economic recovery helped enable the social amnesia about the Nazi past that characterized the 1950s in West Germany. With prosperity returning and the future seeming bright, many Germans preferred not to dwell on the difficult questions about what they had done or tolerated during the Third Reich. The Braun family's ability to blend into this prospering society, to live quietly and respectably without their past being constantly invoked, was made possible by the broader social tendency to look forward rather than backward. This changed somewhat in the 1960s with the generational conflicts and renewed examination of Nazi crimes, but by then the Brauns had established their pattern of silence that would serve them through subsequent decades. The role of the Catholic Church in post-war Germany also had implications for the Braun family. They were Catholics in a predominantly Catholic region of Bavaria, and the Church played a significant role in post-war reconstruction and in providing social services and community support. The Church's complicated relationship with Nazism, having initially opposed it but later accommodating it to varying degrees, meant that the Church was not in a strong position to demand harsh accountability from Catholic families who had been associated with the regime. The Braun family's Catholicism may have provided them with a measure of social integration and community support that eased their reintegration into post-war society. Whether they were active in their parish or maintained only nominal religious affiliation is not documented, but their Catholic background was part of their social identity in a region where religious affiliation mattered for community integration and social networks. The question of whether any member of the Braun family ever expressed regret or remorse for their association with Hitler and the Nazi regime is difficult to answer definitively given their preference for privacy. In their interrogations by Allied authorities, both Fritz and Gretl reportedly emphasized that they had not been party members and had not supported Nazi ideology, but these statements were made in contexts where denying Nazi sympathies was obviously in their interest. Whether they felt genuine remorse for their complicity, however passive, in the Nazi regime, or whether they viewed themselves primarily as victims of circumstances is unknown. The pattern of silence they maintained suggests either that they did not feel comfortable making public statements of remorse, perhaps fearing they would ring hollow or would invite further scrutiny, or that they did not feel personally responsible for crimes they had not personally committed. The second possibility is troubling to those who believe that everyone who benefited from the Nazi regime bears some measure of moral responsibility, but it is also psychologically understandable as a defense mechanism against overwhelming guilt. In the final analysis, the story of Eva Braun's family after World War II is a story of survival, adaptation, and the long shadow of history. They survived the immediate chaos of Germany's defeat, adapted to the transformed society that emerged from the ruins, and lived their lives under a shadow they could neither escape nor fully illuminate. They were neither the worst of the Nazi-affiliated families, having committed no personal crimes and having cooperated with denazification authorities, nor were they among those who actively confronted the past and sought redemption through public acknowledgement and education. They occupied a middle ground of quiet acceptance, neither defending the indefensible nor fully reckoning with their connection to it. This ambiguous position has made them somewhat frustrating subjects for historians and moralists who prefer clearer narratives of either redemption or condemnation. But perhaps their very ordinariness, their choice of privacy and normalcy over drama and confrontation, makes them representative of how many Germans dealt with the aftermath of the Third Reich. The legacy of Eva Braun's family extends beyond their own lives to raise questions that remain relevant in contemporary discussions of historical memory, collective guilt, and the responsibilities of descendants. As societies around the world grapple with legacies of slavery, colonialism, genocide, and other historical wrongs, the question of how descendants should relate to these pasts becomes increasingly important. The Braun family's strategy of silence and privacy represents one possible response, though not necessarily a model to be emulated. Their experience suggests both the possibility of moving beyond a traumatic past without fully confronting it, and the limitations and costs of that approach. They achieved a measure of peace and normalcy, but at the cost of leaving historical questions unanswered and moral accountings incomplete. Whether this trade-off was worth making is a question each generation of the family has had to answer for themselves. For contemporary Germany, the existence of families like the Brauns serves as a reminder that history is not abstract but lives on in real people who carry its weight. The descendants of those connected to the Nazi regime are German citizens with the same rights and responsibilities as anyone else, yet they also bear a unique historical burden. German society has had to find ways to acknowledge this burden without imposing collective guilt, to remember the past without scapegoating the descendants, and to demand moral reckoning without violating individual privacy and dignity. This balancing act is never perfect and remains contested, but it represents Germany's ongoing attempt to be a society that honestly confronts its past, while allowing individuals to build lives that are not entirely defined by that past. The Braun family's experience, with all its ambiguities and unresolved tensions, is part of this larger story of how Germany has tried to come to terms with the Third Reich's legacy. The educational dimension of this legacy is also significant. How do German schools teach about the Third Reich when some students are descended from Nazi officials or collaborators? How do history curricula balance the need to convey the full horror of Nazi crimes with sensitivity to students who may be processing difficult family histories? These questions have been central to Holocaust education in Germany, which seeks to be comprehensive and unflinching in its presentation of Nazi crimes, while also creating space for all students, including those with complicated family backgrounds, to engage with the material. The Braun descendants who attended German schools in the decades since the war would have encountered increasingly detailed and critical instruction about the Third Reich and the Holocaust. For Eva Barbara, Fegelein in the 1950s and 1960s, this education would have been less comprehensive than what her own children would have received in the 1970s and beyond. But even in the earlier period, there was some treatment of the Nazi period in schools. How she processed learning in a classroom setting about events in which her own family had been peripherally involved is unrecorded, but must have been deeply uncomfortable. The media's treatment of Eva Braun and her family has evolved significantly over the decades. Early portrayals in the 1950s and 1960s often sensationalized Eva as Hitler's mistress, focusing on the scandalous or romantic aspects of their relationship while glossing over its moral dimensions. These portrayals frustrated both serious historians who wanted more rigorous analysis and the Braun family who saw their relative portrayed in ways that were simultaneously glamorizing and demeaning. Later treatments became more nuanced, attempting to place Eva in the context of women's roles in the Third Reich and examining her choices through the lens of complicity and moral responsibility. The most recent scholarly and popular works have tried to avoid both the extremes of demonization and romanticization, presenting Eva as a complex historical figure whose choices had real consequences, even though she held no official power. The Braun family has witnessed all these evolving portrayals without significantly influencing them, having chosen not to participate in most media representations of Eva's life and death. The question of material inheritance within the Braun family is another dimension worth considering. Beyond the question of Eva's photographs and documents, there is the matter of any physical property or financial assets that may have passed through the family. Eva herself had accumulated significant wealth during her years with Hitler, who provided her with generous allowances and expensive gifts. Some of this wealth was in the form of jewelry, furs, and other luxury goods that could potentially have survived the war and been passed down through the family. Other assets may have been in the form of savings or investments that were wiped out by the post-war currency reforms or seized as part of denazification proceedings. Whether the family retained any significant material inheritance from Eva, or whether it was all lost in the chaos of 1945 and the subsequent legal proceedings, is not entirely clear from public records. The denazification fines suggest that some assets were identified and seized, but these fines were modest enough that they probably did not capture the full value of what Eva had accumulated during her years with Hitler. The psychological literature on intergenerational trauma provides a framework for understanding what the Braun family descendants may have experienced. Research on the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors has documented the ways in which trauma can be transmitted across generations, even to those who did not directly experience the traumatic events. Similar processes may occur in the families of perpetrators, where guilt, shame, and unresolved moral questions create psychological burdens that affect subsequent generations. The specific dynamics differ, of course. The descendants of perpetrators face different psychological challenges than the descendants of victims, but both groups must find ways to integrate difficult historical legacies into their contemporary identities. For the Braun family, This integration appears to have involved compartmentalization, maintaining a division between public and private life, between acknowledged family history and day-to-day existence. This strategy may have psychological costs that are not visible from the outside, but that family members have had to navigate privately. The role of family secrets and silence in shaping identity is particularly relevant to understanding the Braun family's experience. What was discussed within the family about Eva, about Hermann Fegelein, about their connections to Hitler? What was deliberately not discussed, left unspoken in a family culture of protective silence? These questions about internal family dynamics are impossible to answer definitively from the outside, but they are crucial to understanding how subsequent generations made sense of their heritage. Eva Barbara Fegelein grew up in a household where her mother and grandparents knew the full truth about her father and her aunt, but chose to share only carefully edited versions of that truth with her. The discovery of the fuller story as she entered adolescence and adulthood must have been profoundly destabilizing, raising questions not only about her relatives, but about why she had been kept in the dark and what else might not be as she had been told. This dynamic of discovering family secrets is traumatic under any circumstances. But when the secrets involve connections to one of history's greatest evils, the trauma is magnified enormously. The contemporary relevance of the Braun family's story extends into current debates about historical memory and monuments. As societies around the world grapple with questions about Confederate statues in the United States, colonial monuments in Europe, and memorials to problematic historical figures everywhere, the question of how to remember people like Eva Braun becomes part of this larger conversation. Eva herself has no monuments or memorials, and any attempt to create one would rightfully be met with outrage and condemnation. But her grave, if it exists as an identifiable location, represents a different kind of memorial. A private space where her family might have mourned their loss even as the world condemned her choices. The disposition of Eva and Hitler's remains after their deaths in the bunker is a complex story in itself. Soviet forces recovered the charred bodies from the Reich Chancellery Garden, conducted autopsies to confirm their identities, and then reburied them secretly multiple times over the following decades. The remains were finally exhumed and completely destroyed in 1970, with the ashes scattered to prevent any gravesite from becoming a pilgrimage destination for neo-Nazis. For the Braun family, this meant there was no grave to visit, no physical location where they could mourn Eva privately. This absence of a burial site may have complicated their grieving process, denying them the ritual closure that graves and funerals typically provide. The issue of neo-Nazism and far-right extremism in contemporary Germany creates additional complications for the Braun family. Neo-Nazi groups and Hitler admirers maintain a fascination with all aspects of the Third Reich, including Eva Braun. They seek out materials connected to Hitler's personal life, visit sites associated with him, and sometimes contact or attempt to contact the families of those who were close to Hitler. The Braun family's need to maintain privacy is thus not merely a personal preference but also a practical necessity to avoid unwanted attention from extremists who might view them as connected to a history they wish to glorify. This reality means that the family cannot fully emerge from the shadows of the past, even if they wish to do so. Any public acknowledgement of their family history risks attracting the attention of people who would interpret that acknowledgement in ways the family neither intends nor desires. This dynamic creates a kind of prison of silence, where speaking about the past is dangerous not because of what one says, but because of how it might be received by audiences with disturbing agendas. The legal framework surrounding Nazi crimes and Nazi-related materials in Germany has created specific challenges and protections for families like the Brauns. German law prohibits the glorification of Nazism, the display of Nazi symbols in most contexts, and the denial of the Holocaust. These laws are designed to prevent the resurgence of Nazism and to protect the dignity of Holocaust victims and survivors. However, they also create a legal environment where the Braun family must be careful about how they discuss their history, even in private contexts. A statement defending Eva or Hermann Fegelein could potentially be interpreted as glorifying Nazism, particularly if it became public. This legal context reinforces the family's inclination towards silence, as any public statement about their relatives' choices and actions could potentially have legal implications beyond the social and historical judgment they would already face. Whether this legal framework has been beneficial or counterproductive in helping German society deal with its Nazi past is debated. But for families like the Brauns, it creates an additional layer of complexity in navigating their relationship with history. The digital age has transformed the landscape of privacy and historical memory in ways that have significant implications for the Braun family. The internet has made information about Eva Braun and her family widely accessible, with websites, forums, and social media platforms dedicated to discussing all aspects of the Third Reich. Photographs of Eva that were once difficult to access are now available with a simple search, and documents from her personal archive have been digitized and shared online. This democratization of historical information means that the Braun family can no longer control the narrative about their relatives to the extent that might have been possible in earlier decades. Simultaneously, the internet has made it more difficult for the family to maintain privacy, as genealogical websites, social media platforms, and other digital tools make it easier to identify and potentially contact descendants of historical figures. Whether the Braun family has encountered harassment or unwanted contact through digital channels is unknown, but the potential for such contact is much greater in the age of the internet than it was when maintaining privacy required only avoiding journalists and historians. The historiographical evolution in understanding Eva Braun has implications for how her family is perceived and for how they perceive themselves. Early historical treatments that dismissed Eva as a frivolous non-entity allowed her family to maintain that she had been peripheral to the real evils of the Third Reich, someone who happened to love the wrong man, but who bore no real responsibility for his crimes. More recent scholarship that takes Eva seriously as a historical actor, examining her choices and their implications, makes this defensive position harder to maintain. If Eva was not merely passive but actively chose to support Hitler through her loyalty and companionship, if she had access to information about Nazi crimes and chose to ignore it in order to preserve her comfortable position, then her moral culpability increases significantly. This reassessment of Eva's role has corresponding implications for how we understand her family's position. Were they simply victims of association with someone who made bad choices, or were they complicit beneficiaries of a system they could have chosen to reject? The historical literature increasingly suggests the latter, which may contribute to the family's continued reluctance to engage publicly with their past. The specific case of Eva Barbara Fegelein's life and choices deserves further reflection. Born at the precise moment when the Third Reich collapsed, she represents the first generation to have no personal memory of Nazism, but to carry its genetic and historical legacy nonetheless. Her choice to maintain absolute privacy, to refuse all interviews and public discussion of her family history, is understandable, but also leaves important questions unanswered. As one of the last direct links to Eva Braun through family connection and personal relationship with those who knew Eva intimately, Eva Barbara could potentially provide insights that no historian or archive can offer. Her silence means that these insights, if they exist, will die with her. Whether she has an obligation to share what she knows or whether her right to privacy trumps historical and public interest is a question without an easy answer. On one hand, the pursuit of historical knowledge and understanding is important, and first-hand testimony from family members is invaluable. On the other hand, Eva Barbara bears no personal responsibility for her aunt's choices or her father's crimes, and demanding that she publicly account for them seems to violate basic principles of individual autonomy and dignity. The question of apology and acknowledgement from the Braun family represents another dimension of their post-war experience. Some descendants of Nazi officials have made public statements acknowledging their ancestors' crimes and expressing remorse for the harm they caused. These statements do not erase the past or absolve the perpetrators, but they represent a form of moral reckoning that some find meaningful. The Braun family has not made such public statements, at least not in widely reported forums. Whether this absence reflects a lack of remorse, a different understanding of their responsibility, or simply a judgment that public statements would be performative and unhelpful, is impossible to determine from the outside. The very question of what the Braun family should apologize for is complex. Should they apologize for Eva's relationship with Hitler, for benefiting from that relationship, for Hermann Fegelein's war crimes, for not having done more to oppose the Nazi regime? Each of these implies a different understanding of where responsibility lies and what acknowledgement would mean. The family's silence leaves these questions unresolved, which may be precisely the point. By refusing to engage with demands for apology or acknowledgement, they reject the framework that would require them to account, publicly, for choices they did not make. The intersection of personal trauma and historical significance in the Braun family's experience creates unique challenges for how we understand and evaluate their choices. From a personal perspective, the family members experience genuine trauma. Gretl lost her sister and her husband in quick succession under horrific circumstances and was left to raise an infant daughter in a devastated country. Eva Barbara grew up without a father and eventually learned terrible truths about him. The elder Brauns watched their daughter die by suicide alongside one of history's most evil men. These experiences caused real suffering that deserves some measure of compassion, even as we recognize that the suffering was connected to morally indefensible associations with the Nazi regime. From a historical perspective, however, the family's trauma is inseparable from their complicity, however passive or indirect. Their suffering was caused by their proximity to evil, a proximity they chose or at least accepted, and from which they materially benefited. Balancing compassion for their personal suffering with condemnation of their association with Nazism requires a nuanced understanding that popular discourse often struggles to maintain. The generational differences in how the Braun family has been perceived and has perceived itself are worth examining more closely. For Fritz and Fanny Braun, who were adults during Hitler's rise and rule, the question of personal choice and responsibility is most acute. They could have forbidden Eva from seeing Hitler, though their ability to enforce such a prohibition once she was an adult, and he was the most powerful man in Germany, was limited. They could have refused the benefits that came from her relationship, though this would have required extraordinary moral courage and would have alienated them from their daughter. They made choices that prioritized family loyalty and material comfort over moral principle, choices that millions of other Germans made in various forms during the Third Reich. Their denazification as fellow travelers reflected this common pattern of accommodation and complicity without active participation in crimes. For Ilsa and Gretl, the question of choice is more complicated. They were young women in a society that gave women limited agency, and their connection to Eva and through her to Hitler was mediated by family loyalty. They benefited from these connections, but in ways that were more passive than active. Their post-war lives reflected attempts to distance themselves from this past while maintaining family bonds and protecting their own interests. For Eva Barbara and her descendants, the question of choice largely disappears and is replaced by the question of inheritance. They did not choose their genealogy or their family history. They have had to make choices about how to relate to that history, whether to acknowledge it publicly or maintain privacy, whether to condemn their ancestors or defend them, or simply remain silent. Their choices have been shaped by the options available to them in a society that has evolved in its relationship with the Nazi past, becoming increasingly demanding of acknowledgement and moral clarity, even as it has also become more removed from the events themselves. The fact that Eva Barbara and her children have chosen privacy does not necessarily indicate a lack of moral awareness or a refusal to confront the past. It may instead reflect a judgment that public confrontation would serve no useful purpose and would only subject them to judgment and scrutiny they cannot escape, regardless of what they say or do. Whether this judgment is correct, or whether the family has a responsibility to contribute to public understanding, despite the personal cost, is a question that each observer must answer according to their own values and priorities. The comparative dimension of the Braun family's experience with other families connected to Hitler's inner circle reveals interesting patterns. The Goebbels family faced perhaps the most extreme version of this legacy, as Josef and Magda Goebbels murdered their 6 children before committing suicide in the bunker days after Hitler's death. The absence of surviving children from that family means there were no direct descendants to carry forward the family name or to struggle with its implications. Martin Bormann's children, in contrast, survived and took varying approaches to their heritage, with some like Martin Bormann Jr. becoming priests and missionaries in apparent attempts at redemption, while others maintained lower profiles. The Speer family saw similar variation, with Albert Speer himself expressing selective remorse after his release from prison, and his children navigating their own relationships with their father's legacy. Compared to these families, the Brauns have been remarkable in their consistency of approach across generations. maintaining privacy and silence rather than oscillating between defense and condemnation. This consistency may reflect a family culture established early in the post-war period and maintained through subsequent generations, or it may simply be that the particular individuals in the Braun family have independently arrived at similar conclusions about the best way to manage their difficult inheritance. The role of gender in shaping both the historical events and their aftermath cannot be overstated in understanding the Braun family's story. Eva Braun was a woman in a society that severely restricted women's roles and agency. Her relationship with Hitler was shaped by these gender dynamics, with Eva occupying a domestic and decorative role that was considered appropriate for women even as the regime proclaimed ideology about women's place in society. The post-war treatment of Eva and her female relatives reflected gendered assumptions about women's political awareness and responsibility, generally treating them more leniently than men in comparable positions. Whether this leniency was justified or whether it represented a form of sexism that infantilized women and denied their capacity for moral agency is a question that feminist historical scholarship has begun to explore. For the Braun women, the gendered nature of their treatment had practical benefits in the denazification process, but may have also contributed to a narrative that minimized their own choices and agency, portraying them as victims or bystanders when they were in fact participants who made meaningful choices within the constraints available to them. The economic legacy of the Braun family's connection to Hitler represents a final dimension worth exploring. Beyond the immediate material benefits they received during the war and the modest denazification fines they paid afterward, there is the question of longer-term economic impact. Did the family's notorious surname create barriers to employment and business opportunities that had lasting economic consequences? Did the eventual economic recovery of West Germany benefit them equally to other Germans, or did their background create disadvantages that persisted across generations? The limited information available suggests that the family achieved a comfortable middle-class existence in the post-war decades, neither facing severe economic hardship nor enjoying exceptional prosperity. This economic normalization was made possible partly by the broader economic miracle that lifted most West Germans, partly by the family's ability to quietly reintegrate into society, and partly by the passage of time that gradually reduced the salience of their surname. The potential value of materials from Eva's estate represented an economic windfall that could have significantly improved the family's finances, though the extent to which they profited from sales of such materials versus preserving them or having them seized by authorities remains unclear. The question of what the Braun family thinks about Eva Braun herself is perhaps the most intimate and unknowable aspect of their story. Do they view her as a victim who loved the wrong man, as a willing participant in evil who got what she deserved, or as something more complex that resists simple moral categorization? Family loyalty would naturally incline them toward a sympathetic interpretation, seeing Eva as someone whose choices were constrained by the circumstances of her time and her gender, someone who perhaps made mistakes, but who did not deserve the vilification she has received. At the same time, the historical record makes clear that Eva lived in extraordinary luxury while millions suffered and died, that she remained loyal to Hitler even as evidence of his crimes mounted, and that she chose to die with him rather than to condemn him or attempt to make amends. Any honest family reckoning with Eva's life would have to acknowledge these uncomfortable facts. Whether such a reckoning has occurred within the family circle, perhaps in conversations between Gretl and Eva Barbara, or between Eva Barbara and her children, is unknown. The public silence the family has maintained could mask either profound private struggle with these moral questions or a defensive rejection of them. The impact of Holocaust education and memorialization on the Braun family's experience deserves consideration. As Germany has developed extensive Holocaust memorials, museums, and educational programs, the descendants of those connected to the Nazi regime have had to navigate environments where their ancestors' role in enabling the Holocaust is publicly condemned. For students visiting concentration camp memorials or Holocaust museums, the experience is designed to convey the full horror of Nazi crimes and to ensure that such atrocities are never forgotten or repeated. For students who are descended from Nazi officials or their associates, this experience must be profoundly uncomfortable, forcing them to confront the fact that their own ancestors were part of the system that perpetrated these crimes. how Eva Barbara and her children experienced Holocaust education if they participated in school trips to memorial sites like Dachau, which is near Munich, is unrecorded. Did they feel able to participate fully in the educational experience, or did their family background create a barrier that prevented them from engaging with the material in the same way as their peers? These questions about the psychological impact of Holocaust education on descendants of perpetrators are important for educators to consider as they design programs that must serve diverse student populations. The international dimension of the Braun family story is also significant. Eva Braun's name is known internationally, not just in Germany, making the family's connection to Hitler a global, rather than merely national issue. This international recognition means that even if the family could achieve some degree of anonymity within Germany by avoiding publicity, they could never entirely escape their association with Eva on a global scale. Foreign journalists, historians, and curiosity seekers have periodically sought out the family for interviews or information, requiring them to navigate not just German society but international attention as well. The family's consistent refusal of such attention suggests a recognition that engaging with international media would only amplify their visibility and make privacy even harder to maintain. The global nature of Holocaust remembrance and education means that Eva Braun appears in textbooks, documentaries, and historical accounts around the world, ensuring that her name and by extension her family's connection to Hitler remains known far beyond Germany's borders. The role of chance and contingency in the Braun family story is worth reflecting upon. If Eva had never gone to work at Heinrich Hoffmann's photography studio, she would never have met Hitler, and the family's history would have been entirely different. If Hitler had died in one of the numerous assassination attempts made on his life, Eva might have eventually married someone else and lived an unremarkable life. If Hermann Fegelein had not been executed in the bunker but had instead survived to face trial at Nuremberg, Gretl's life trajectory would have been very different, perhaps even more difficult. If Eva Barbara had been a boy instead of a girl, the family might have faced even more intense scrutiny and judgment, given gendered assumptions about inheritance of character and responsibility. These counterfactuals underscore how much of the family's fate was determined by circumstances beyond their control, by decisions made by others, and by the particular contingencies of how events unfolded in April and May 1945. While this does not absolve them of responsibility for the choices they did make, it does provide some context for understanding their situation, as one shaped by forces larger than any individual or family could fully control or resist. The psychological concept of complicated grief may be relevant to understanding the Braun family's experience, particularly Gretl's loss of both her sister and her husband in the space of a few days. Complicated grief refers to grief that is made more difficult by circumstances that prevent normal mourning processes. In Gretl's case, the circumstances of Eva and Hermann's deaths made mourning extremely complicated. She could not openly mourn her sister without seeming to mourn Hitler, and she could not mourn her husband without acknowledging that he had been a war criminal executed for desertion. The absence of bodies or proper burial sites further complicated the grief process. The social stigma associated with both deaths would have prevented Gretl from receiving the sympathy and support that usually help people process loss. She would have had to grieve alone or within a very small circle of family members who were themselves traumatized and stigmatized. This complicated grief may have had lasting psychological effects on Gretl and may have shaped how she raised her daughter Eva Barbara, potentially creating patterns of silence and avoidance that were transmitted across generations. The question of forgiveness is central to many discussions of the Nazi past and its legacy. Can or should the families of Nazi officials and collaborators be forgiven for their associations and their benefits from the regime? What would forgiveness even mean in this context? Forgiveness typically involves both acknowledgement of wrongdoing and some form of repentance or amends-making. The Braun family's silence makes it impossible to know whether they have privately acknowledged wrongdoing or whether they view themselves as having anything to apologize for. Without such acknowledgement, the question of forgiveness becomes moot in some sense. Who can forgive someone who has not acknowledged a need for forgiveness? At the same time, the passage of time and the absence of personal participation in Nazi crimes by the younger generations raises questions about whether forgiveness is even the right framework. Eva Barbara and her children did not commit crimes or benefit directly from the Nazi regime. They simply inherited a difficult family history. Do they need to be forgiven? Or do they simply need to be allowed to live their lives without being held accountable for their ancestors' choices? The role of documentation and archives in shaping the Braun family's story and their relationship with it is significant. The extensive documentation of the Nazi regime, including captured documents, interrogation transcripts, photographs, and testimony from numerous witnesses, means that the basic facts about Eva Braun's relationship with Hitler and Hermann Fegelein's war crimes are well established regardless of what the family says or does not say. This documentation creates both a burden and a protection for the family. It is a burden because it ensures that their connection to these historical figures cannot be denied or minimized. It is a protection because it means they do not need to serve as sources of information about events that are already well documented. They can maintain their silence without significantly impeding historical understanding. This is quite different from cases where family members are among the only sources of information about historical events and where their refusal to share knowledge creates real gaps in the historical record. The Braun family's privilege of silence is made possible by the extensive documentation that exists independent of their cooperation. The future of the Braun family's legacy as the generations continue to multiply and the genetic connection to Eva Braun becomes increasingly diluted is an open question. Eva Barbara's children are Eva's great-nieces and great-nephews, separated from her by 2 generations. If they have children, those individuals will be 3 generations removed from Eva, sharing only a small fraction of her genetic material and having no direct family connection to anyone who knew her personally. At what point does the family connection become so attenuated that it no longer carries significant meaning or burden? This is both a genealogical question and a social one. Genealogically, each generation halves the genetic connection, so that Eva Barbara's children share only about 12.5% of their genes with Eva, and the next generation will share only about 6.25%. Socially, however, the connection may remain significant as long as the surname or family stories connect individuals to Eva Braun, and through her to Hitler. The persistence of interest in Hitler and the Third Reich suggests that this social connection may remain meaningful for many more generations, even as the genetic link becomes negligible. The ethical questions raised by researching and writing about the Braun family are worth acknowledging. Does the historical importance of understanding Eva Braun's life and Hitler's inner circle justify intruding on the privacy of her surviving relatives? Is there a statute of limitations on public interest in the families of historical figures? A point at which descendants should be allowed to simply be private individuals rather than objects of historical curiosity. Different societies and different historians answer these questions differently, reflecting varying commitments to privacy rights, historical knowledge, and public memory. In the case of the Braun family, the consensus among historians and journalists has generally been that Eva Braun's historical significance justifies limited intrusion on family privacy, but that this intrusion should be proportional to the family member's actual involvement with or knowledge of historically significant events. This explains why there has been substantial interest in interviewing or obtaining information from Ilsa and Gretl, who knew Eva personally and spent time at the Berghof, but somewhat less pressure on Eva Barbara and later generations who had no direct knowledge of the Third Reich. This proportional approach represents an attempt to balance competing values, though whether the balance struck has been appropriate is open to debate. The Braun family's experience also raises questions about the nature of historical justice and whether it has been adequately served in their case. The denazification process classified Fritz and Gretl as fellow travellers and imposed modest fines, allowing them to reintegrate into society relatively quickly. Was this justice, or was it too lenient given their extended benefit from the Nazi regime? There were no further legal proceedings against family members, no attempts to recover additional assets beyond the denazification fines, and no restrictions on their movements or activities beyond the brief initial prohibitions. They were allowed to live, work, and raise children in post-war Germany without ongoing legal consequences. For some observers, this represents appropriate treatment of people who were associated with the regime but who committed no personal crimes. For others, it represents a failure to fully account for complicity and benefit from evil. The question of what would have constituted appropriate consequences for the Braun family is difficult to answer in the abstract. Too harsh, and it would have violated principles of individual responsibility and proportionality. Too lenient, and it would have failed to adequately address their role in supporting and benefiting from the Nazi regime. The actual consequences they faced fell somewhere in the middle, perhaps reflecting the practical necessities of rebuilding German society rather than any clear philosophical principle about historical justice. In considering the totality of the Braun family's experience across nearly 80 years since the end of World War II, several themes emerge consistently. There is the theme of silence and privacy, the choice to withdraw from public engagement with their history and to build lives insulated from constant scrutiny and judgment. There is the theme of inheritance and burden, the way that association with Eva Braun, and through her with Adolf Hitler, has shaped opportunities and experiences across generations, regardless of personal responsibility. There is the theme of adaptation and survival, the family's ability to navigate the transformed landscape of post-war Germany and to achieve some measure of normalcy despite their notorious connections. There is the theme of unresolved questions and incomplete reckonings, the moral and historical issues that remain unaddressed because of the family's silence and privacy. And there is the theme of time's passage, the way that the significance and impact of historical events change as they recede into memory and as the people who lived through them die. These themes interweave throughout the family's story, creating a complex tapestry that resists simple interpretation or judgment. What can be said with certainty is that the Braun family's experience after World War II has been shaped fundamentally by Eva Braun's decision to remain with Adolf Hitler until death. That choice, made in the Führer bunker in late April 1945, set in motion consequences that have reverberated through 3 generations of her family. Her parents, her sisters, her niece, and her great-nieces and great-nephews have all had to live with the aftermath of that choice and the choices that preceded it. They have been required to navigate a society that views their family name with suspicion or curiosity, to answer or deflect questions about their relationship to one of history's most notorious figures, and to build identities that acknowledge but are not entirely defined by their family history. That they have largely succeeded in living relatively normal lives while bearing this extraordinary burden is a testament to their resilience and to the capacity of time and social change to create distance from even the most traumatic historical events. That questions and controversies continue to surround them is a reminder that some historical legacies cannot be fully escaped or resolved, only endured and passed on to subsequent generations who must find their own ways of carrying them forward. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this exploration of Eva Braun's family after World War II informative and thought-provoking. The story of how her relatives navigated the aftermath of the Third Reich offers important insights into questions of guilt, responsibility, and historical memory that remain relevant today. If you enjoyed learning about this topic, make sure to check out our other videos exploring what happened to the families and associates of Nazi leaders after the war. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more fascinating World War II history. Your support helps us continue creating detailed, well-researched content about this crucial period of human history. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.